You know the pressure of telling people that you're going to be dynamic.
Oh, well, Mike, that's on you. I'm just the one asking the questions. I'm just the one asking the questions.
All right.
Well, one more zip. Oh, in the meantime, while we wait, I could probably explain. This is the tarmac that has caused this. It's not my wife. It's not my children. Why don't we get started?
It's a great look, by the way.
You like it? You like it? Thank you so much. Look, sometimes last year, a coronavirus jumped species from an animal still unknown to a human being in Wuhan, China. This virus, also referred to as COVID-19, nothing new really. The virus is so transmissible that within a matter of months, it spread entirely around the world and caused travel to come to a halt. With both Mike and Jayson, I want to talk about the following three things. What happened from a payment perspective in March and April of 2020? What does it mean to our HEDNA members? And what does the future look like? And how do we become better at weathering a similar disruption? So without further ado, let me share my screen. You've already seen them, but why don't we take a minute to welcome both Mike and Jayson. Mike, why don't you give a quick introduction?
Sure. My name is Mike Carlo. I've worked in payments for, I guess we're at decades now. And I have had the pleasure of being on the HEDNA board for the last 6 years or so, focusing on payments. And after a couple of different jobs in the payment field over those 2 decades, I am now running a startup business focused on B2B hotel payments, and company's name is XanderPay. And I would say I'm really looking forward to living up to the pressure of being dynamic for the next 45 minutes.
Excellent.
Thanks,
excellent.
Sebastien.
Jayson, you're probably a little bit more dynamic than Mike. I don't know. We'll measure it.
Probably true, yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, Mike is a tough act to follow. I think all of us who know Mike know that that could be a tough act to follow. But just in terms of a quick introduction, so Jayson Canady, I also sit on the HEDNA board as of the beginning of this year or late last year. Also one of the co-chairs for the guest-centric payments working group. So I've been working with Lori Gablehouse from Ingenico on that over the last few years. From a payments perspective, haven't been in payments quite as long as Mike, but maybe 10, 15 years or so. Really across the payments value chain. So I've been on the issuing side, both some large banks, global banks. Been on the merchant side most recently at Hyatt, and then heading up their payment strategy globally. And then I've done work, consulting work, and helping different payment providers, basically folks in the middle, process payments and provide different services to merchants or banks. So looking forward to this discussion. I think we have some good content for everyone.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, both of you, to give your time, to expertise, and insights. This is certainly going to be a great, insightful conversation. We have a few important events coming up. And
Sebastien,
yes.
As you know, I'm going to interrupt the entire time. Could you go back and look
Sure.
at the sponsored by?
You want to highlight Adyen? I mean, Adyen
We
is
should,
already,
yes.
Yes, no, absolutely we should. Mike, do you want to do the call out and share?
We're just, I mean, I know a number of people on the call compete with Adyen, some work with Adyen as clients, but they've been an amazing payment partner for HEDNA during 2019 and 2020. So this is part of the first of a 3 webinar series that they are sponsoring on behalf of HEDNA as part of their sponsorship. So thanks to the team there. And that's all I needed to say.
Can't wait to hear if we did a good job, but now still let us know. All right, this is one of many HEDNA events that we are planned for the fall. The big one is coming up on October 13, HEDNA at Home. I'm super excited with the programming. I'm super excited of the lineup of speakers that we have. This should be an amazing conversation, a few hours, about 3.5 hours of total duration, with both insights, best practices, working group updates. all you've come expect. Our first event was a great success, and of course we want to make sure that we keep providing you constant insights and influx of new information. As with any HEDNA event, you're bound by the code of conduct. This is applicable to both members and non-members. You can look it up on our website under hedna.org/code of conduct. And it controls things like antitrust, and of course, what information can be shared and cannot be shared. Anyway, I invite you to look it up. Without further ado, why don't we get into the actual conversation? And to all participants, feel free to, drop your questions into the chat. There is a Q&A functionality. We'd be happy to pick them up and address them as we go along. So I want to rewind the clock a little bit and go to roughly March, April timeframe. Myself, I was sitting on packed bags. I was ready to head to the airport to attend, for probably most of you, the largest travel industry show in the world in Berlin, Germany, the International Travel Börse, or also known as ITB. And suddenly everything came to a halt right around the end of February, early March. I don't necessarily want to talk too much about, the booking trends or, the booking volumes that we saw, or the shutdown. But what I want to do is focus a little bit on what happened in the payment world. And Mike, maybe let's start with you. When you think about payments, and especially probably airlines, because that's sort of the first thing that happened, I was able to get my ticket refunded because I had a fairly flexible rate. But can you describe a little bit what happened between March and April from a payment perspective when it comes to airlines?
Yeah, I mean, it was complete chaos. And the difference between airlines and hotels, as we have discussed in the past, is for an airline, when you book your ticket, whether it's refundable, non-refundable, first class, coach, you pay at the time of booking. And so for that reason, the airlines had everyone's cash. And at the point where countries started shutting down, the airlines and their acquirers had really significant decisions to make. Do we refund everything and give up all the cash that we have, which is how we're going to survive? Or do we try to convert people to vouchers? And there were, the airlines in many countries were trying to basically rebook tickets, convert them to vouchers, do as much as they could to hold on to the cash, knowing they were going to need it for the downturn that I don't think anyone at the time thought was going to be as long as it has been. So I think that given their model, there was a lot more complexity to what they needed to do with payments versus hotels where you just canceled a booking and you never got the cash that you thought you were going to get. So as that progressed, different countries decided there were different rules. And honestly, the simple fact that the governments pitched in as much as they did with the air industry is the reason we haven't lost tens, dozens of major carriers globally. I'm not sure how long that's going to last, but the government inflow of cash to save the airline industry, coupled with the fact that they were able to push a lot of the bookings out, was largely related to their previous payment strategies. You're on mute, Sebastien.
Thank you. Jayson, can you talk a little bit what happened from a hotelier's perspective around that March, April timeframe?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we all have seen the headlines. I won't spend, a lot of time rehashing a lot of the past, but, demand, almost went to zero, almost overnight. And, I think hotels were also then trying to figure out, with the volume of refunds and cancellations, did they have the liquidity to issue all those refunds and, obviously continue to run whatever portion of the business that remained and continue to service their debt on, their capital and in their locations and so forth. I think the biggest challenge around that time, and I think it's something we're definitely going to address here. And I think payments.com did an article right around week 8 or week 12 or so of this pandemic. And they were talking about it took somewhere between 10 and 12 weeks for consumers' expectations around payments to shift in a way that's pretty permanent, right? And if you think that the hotels globally already had a gap of this between companies and brands that our guests interact with every day, be it the Starbucks of the world, Walmarts, McDonald's, different places like that, Alipay, etc. That gap went maybe from this to this almost 10 or 12 week span, because those companies were already ahead of the game in terms of contactless, seamless, and different types of experiences and payment scenarios, where in hospitality, unfortunately, for a lot of different reasons, which we'll talk about, we hadn't been able to address some of those gaps. And so I think where we sit today is a gap that perhaps continues to widen. And I think from a hospitality perspective, it's trying to understand, how do you close those gaps? How do you find the right partners? And obviously contend in some cases with regulatory issues that are happening, at least in Europe, and probably will migrate to other places around the globe.
Okay, interesting. So I guess from a merchant perspective, were you receiving now, I guess, invoices from your from a payment processor? Is that what happened as a result?
I mean, I can't specifically talk about Hyatt or anything else, but I think it was more about with that demand dropping that I mentioned, then you had businesses, right? Because obviously we got to talk about the B2B cases and events that large companies were booking to obviously consumers, and there was a lot of cancellations that was coming. So we had to respond to those financial pressures, right? But also, quite frankly, and I think this is where Mike was talking about Adyen and the spirit of partnership, whether it's companies that use Adyen or any other processor. Those relationships are very important in terms of making sure you're communicating the current status of your business and quite frankly, any help or assistance you might need from your payment processor to respond to the sheer volume of refunds that were coming across during that time, or anything else that you might need in the short term to make it through those choppy waters. So it wasn't so much invoicing per se, but it was more about responding to a lot of those invoices and again, making sure you can leverage that relationship with your payments partner or partners to weather the storm a little bit.
Interesting. And as you sort of think about in hindsight, to this moment, March, April, nobody expected this level of cancellation, this immediate shutdown ever to happen. I want to sort of, and maybe we'll answer it in a simple question, what should we have done differently as an industry is, I guess, one that I want to start answering throughout this conversation. What can we do differently moving forward so that when such disruptive event occurs, we're better set. But maybe start with you, Jayson. In hindsight, would you have done anything different?
I don't know. I think where your question, at least from my perspective, is getting to is around BCP or business continuity planning, right? And so while you might have, in some cases, some companies running scenarios around systems going down, that's one way to talk about disaster and disaster recovery or continuity planning, but how do you respond and plan for, anticipate, et cetera, react when your business itself is shutting down? I think those are two different things. And so, what my response to that question is, how can you plan for severe business disruptions that are not technology oriented, perhaps aren't even caused by nature, but really caused by, in this case, a pandemic? And how do you plan cross-functionally with all your different teams, partners, and et cetera, that you have a plan to get through those events? I think that's what a lot of companies probably now are sitting in virtual huddle rooms to try and figure out, how do we plan for different type of scenarios in the future going forward.
Mike, do you want to have a shot at answering what would you have done differently?
How much time do we have?
Right somewhere.
So, I completely agree with Jayson from the point of our infrastructure today as the industry. But if you look at what happened with the hotels versus what happened with the airlines and some of the OTAs, to me, one of the recurring challenges with the hotel industry and payments is the notion of post-paid versus prepaid transactions. As a HEDNA board member, we can't say one is better than the other. We shouldn't say one is better than the other because they're different consumer demands. If one looks at it simply from a cash flow standpoint, the airlines had billions of dollars in their bank accounts that had not yet been earned. I mean, basically they sold the tickets, and then over the next 9 months, those tickets' value would have been used. Hotels with such a small percentage of prepaid bookings had a much smaller percentage of cash available. And when the bookings stopped, there was no way for them to get additional cash. And so the airlines had the ability to, as I said earlier, to try to rebook 6 months later, offer a voucher, and they were able to manage their cash a little differently. I think that looking back to the pandemic starting in March and April, and looking forward to whatever is going to happen the next 6 months, cash is really important in order to be able to address the business continuity. So I think one of the areas that I would have done differently as an industry is be more aware of cash flow when it comes to payments and payment strategies.
Yeah.
And manage that more, I guess, conservatively in a way?
Well, maybe not conservatively, but just you have more options. And then, Jayson, I know we've talked about this in the past, but the hotel industry also wasn't, and the cancellations weren't monolithic. You had a lot of meeting and events that canceled, and you ran into challenges with, you as a meeting planner, you had a relationship with a brand, but that brand couldn't necessarily control how the specific hotel engaged with a refund policy. And so I think the hotels were trying to hold on to, from meeting events, were trying to hold on to cash flow as much as they could because they needed to pay their loans and survive. And so I think that the structural payment infrastructure for hotels has never been, because of the ownership structure of the properties, cash flow has never been a primary factor in payment strategy for hotels. And I think we would have been in a much different place in March and April had we a different approach to it as an industry.
I think, I would just maybe add on to that, Mike. Maybe what I'm interpreting you saying is, I think in a lot of cases, these payments roles, at least at the hotel, kind of brand level, many of them actually, at least at a strategy or kind of product, a lot of them are sitting in treasury. So you would think that by the sheer nature of being in that group, that there would have been this tighter linkage between payments, forecasting, refund, all those types of things that we're talking about. And I think what we saw happen was, although you had to see at the table, so to speak, payments, that linkage from a cash flow and forecasting and planning scenarios, all those kinds of things, wasn't as tight as we perhaps needed it, be it at the brand level or even at the property level. So I imagine there's a lot of treasurers at some of these brands saying, hey, we really need to make sure not only does payments sit there because we're bringing payments in and it kind of deals with money, but goes beyond that. How does payments become more strategic in forecasting for for a variety of different scenarios, like complete loss of demand, right, and refunds, etc. So hopefully those types of things and outcomes are taking place at the highest, the Marriott's, the different brands around the world.
Well, and I think that's Sebastien, might go kind of a little bit off your schedule.
Please.
Okay. I think that's one of the areas that you just mentioned, Jayson, is one of the big challenges going into the fall. And you're right. The treasury folks at the brands, they understand what's going on, but they're understanding what's going on for the brand. I don't know that most of the brand treasurers are looking at the financial statements of each of the individual properties. And that's where it becomes sort of really challenging. Like there was an LA Times article this week, which I found very disturbing and going into the fall. I want to get the number right. The article, if you're looking for it, is the tsunami of hotel closings. And apparently 16.7% of US hotel loans are currently late, which means there's a good chance that a lot of them are going to close. That normal number is between 1% and 2%. So we're going into a season where we would be relying on business travel to fill up the rooms because the summer holiday schedule in the Northern Hemisphere is winding down. You're going into this with companies that manage the hotels already are cash starved, and there's probably going to be a really significant dip in demand, which is going to lead to hotel closure. So if I'm that treasurer at a brand, I mean, you kind of need to understand, let's say 16% of your properties are going out of business. You have a relationship with a customer who relates to your brand, not the ownership group of the hotel. The fact that our payment structure is scattered across each individual property is really a problem now. And this is, I know we'll get to what we need to do going forward, Sebastien, but like this to me is the primary risk we have going into the next 6 months. Hotel brands individual hotels are going to go out of business. If I'm a treasurer at the brand, I want to interact with that customer at a brand level so that if that Hilton or DoubleTree, and just use an example for our Hilton friends, I'm a loyalty member, which is why it came to mind. If I'm going to Barcelona and I'm staying at a Hilton and that particular property goes out of business, I want that booking to be moved to another Hilton property in that area. So that to me is the fundamental, quick, rapid change that the treasurer types that you're talking about need to react really quickly on. Sorry, Sebastien.
If I'm
you knew I was going to do it.
And I want to just tie up on that statement that you made. If I'm a treasurer at that brand, wouldn't I be much more, I guess, risk averse in paying out? Like, wouldn't I sort of want to make sure that I pay just in time then my member properties?
Yes.
Will this lead to, I guess, a reduction in how payments are processed in advance? Or will there be?
We've been looking at that. So we'll talk about the working groups later, but we have our HEDNA Open Payment Alliance working group that's focusing on the B2B payment infrastructure and designing a payment manager. And over the course of the last 6 months, we've started to look at that payment manager, and one of the key components in there is a date of payment. And basically, right now there are all sorts of lags in time, and there are different risks, and we can talk about those later. But if we can identify effectively a just-in-time payment approach to the industry rapidly, that will solve a lot of the risks of business failure that we'll see in multiple directions.
So let's talk about now, and thank you for sort of that history component. So in summary, airlines were hit with, you know, chargebacks and refund requests significantly because they were sitting on the cash flow. Hotels to a lesser extent. That's sort of, in summary, a good synopsis.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Talking about now travel is, I guess, a fraction of what it has been. We look at different, you know, reports on, are we at 30%? Are we at 20%? Are we at 40, 50% of the typical volumes? And it will vary very greatly by location and property type. Having said that, what I'm curious about is your perspective on the current, I guess, behavior of customer. Do you think there was a change in how payments are made right now? Meaning, you know, people, maybe start with the most, you know, simple one. Are customers booking non-refundable rates that are paid in advance or not? And maybe, you know, guys, we have a few participants, quite a few actually, that are attending live. Drop your feedback, drop your commentary in the chat box. Are we seeing more or less non-refundable reservations happening right now? Mike, Jayson, what's your perspective?
I mean, I'm personally not close enough to booking data to give an exact answer on that, but I think, you know, the brands have done a good job of responding to the current situation and updating, continuously updating, in some cases, you know, their cancellation and refund policy. I think what we need to make sure happens from a payment perspective is however that policy gets modified over time, that the payments infrastructure system, ecosystem, et cetera, that particular brand is working within, including partners, is aware of what those policy changes are, so that operationally they can respond to, you know, those changes, right, and provide a good experience for, you know, their customers as they're, you know, making a booking and, you know, in some cases canceling or changing reservations, right? And, you know, if we don't do that, kind of shame on us, right, for not learning from the very beginning of this process. I think, again, that disconnect between some policies and some other organizations in some cases and what's happening on the payment side hasn't always been linked, and hopefully we start to close that gap internally between, you know, different groups. So I hope, you know, we're continuously learning.
If I could add, I think that some of the webinars that I've been on, I mean, you generally have not had a lot of advance booking. So, you know, I don't think you're seeing people booking rooms for next summer or for, you know, even the holidays. I think everyone's just taking a wait and see attitude. So, you know, effectively, you're getting to a point where, you know, if everyone's booking last minute, you don't really have an issue with, you know, prepaid or postpaid. It's just all at the same time. I think there's an element of delusion going on in our industry, and I think the timing of the summer season made it really seem like everything was recovering, and I think that, and to a large extent, a certain group of hotels did do well, summer resorts and outside of cities.
Yep.
We also, again, they're going to, as we go into this quiet season, I am very fearful that there are going to be a lot of companies that go out of business, both hotels, probably not brands, third-party tour operators, OTAs. I mean, there are so many companies that have cash needs, and there's going to be such a dearth of demand, Darth, however one says that. I think that when we start to hear about some of the high high profile bankruptcies, that's when consumers are going to change their habits. Until then, and hopefully I'm wrong and it doesn't happen, but once that starts to happen, you're going to see a flock to booking at known entities. And I just, the here in LA, the Lux Hotel on Rodeo Drive closed. In New York, the Hilton in Times Square closed. Those are starting to be some of the high profile businesses going out of business. But if that becomes more the norm, I think you're going to see consumer behavior change very rapidly.
And what you're expecting, and we're heading towards sort of our last chapter, which is what does the future look like? When we talk about consumer behavior changes, Mike, can you be a bit more specific what you mean by that? Is it who you pay? Is it how much you pay? Is it how you pay? Like, walk me through what you're expecting as changes.
Well, let me answer your question with a question. If you book a hotel and you pay a prepaid rate for something, and then that hotel goes out of business, what do you do? Or if you go to book through an OTA and that OTA goes out of business and you show up at your hotel and the hotel said, oh, we don't have a reservation for you, even though you've paid the OTA because the OTA went out of business and didn't pay us. I mean, that's the fabric of risk that we have in the coming months. And, with, the impact of social media and the impact of a press that's just eager to point out, this, oh my God, there's flooding because of this hurricane, and they show a little puddle in a yard. The press eager to sensationalize COVID and our industry very much as part of that. I think that's when behaviors will change dramatically. And I don't really know if I answered your question, but I mentioned a puddle.
And I'll turn it over to Jayson. But I look, I think, Mike, you brought up some great points. But what I guess all I'm saying is customer behavior changing from a payment perspective, like moving forward? And yes, we'll be at a lower level. Yes, we'll be running at 30% of, or 40 or 50, whatever that number is, of the previous booking volumes. Customers going to change how they
before you go to Jayson, just to highlight one thing. Sorry, Jayson. My point is, I don't think consumer behaviors are changing yet. If there are reports of people being stuck at a hotel and having paid their OTA and not getting in their room, that's when I think their payment selections will change.
Jayson, what's your view?
Well, I started the conversation around that payments.com article, which talked about, it only took 12 weeks for consumer behavior to change, at least from a payment perspective. And I think the example I would use is, at least here in the US, the usage of QR codes. I think before this happened, there was a very small percentage of people who either A, knew what a QR code was, B, who actually even used one. And now, my parents, who are late 70s and 80s, they know what a damn QR code is, right? And so, I just use that as an example to say that these things they have gotten fast-tracked. They become part of the everyday dining, ordering, whatever payment experience. And some of these changes are going to stay. Some will perhaps evaporate. I think as a hotel industry, we've got to figure out what are those trends that are going around payments and just overall experience design. Like, what are those things that we believe are going to stay? And again, making sure that we're starting to build those that, build to, meet those new expectations. And again, because payments is complicated, you got to have the right partners to pull all this stuff together. So, it's truly hard to say exactly what's going to stay and what's not, but I do think things like QR codes and perhaps some mobile ordering and some other different things that are happening in QSR restaurants will be needed in the hotel space, and we've got to adapt accordingly.
Let's talk a little bit about risk. Let's assume for a second that all payments and transactions are made last minute. Is that a challenge for, I guess, risk and fraud, or are we, is this not an issue?
Well, if you're asking me, in terms of, I don't have the data, but I imagine the booking windows are shortening, right? Which, I don't want to get into all the details, but depending on the type of booking that is, going back to prepaid or postpaid, and now we've got more people using mobile keys and direct to room, those types of mobile check-in experiences. The fraud risk or exposure, is definitely goes up. I don't know by what percentage, but pretty significantly. And so I think for the hoteliers who are listening, again, finding the right fraud partner, you can plug into your platforms, et cetera, in a seamless way to the consumer, is should be at the forefront of your the payment strategy. So hopefully, we're all thinking about trying to tighten up our fraud rules to meet these new expectations and shorter booking windows.
So I guess let me rephrase the question maybe to Mike. Do you think this crisis will lead to an acceleration of the introduction of and adoption of strong customer authentication, 3DS, whatever version, in order to sort of, decrease the risk profile of a transaction and ultimately give us the confidence that this is a, customer that is real and that is, that has the funds?
Yeah, that's a great perspective, and it ties into what Jayson was talking about earlier about QR codes and whatnot. I think that the more we move to card not present payments, the less the consumer risk is, because there are ample tools in the payment industry to identify fraud and prevent chargebacks. It's something that as an industry, hoteliers have not been at the forefront, because all of the payments, almost all of the payments are done at property level. And so I think that the SCA reference that you made, I think that is driving a lot of larger hotel brands to look at what element of payments can be centralized. And ultimately that does reduce our risk as an industry. I think the real risk is not the consumer-based transactions. The risks to me are more of the B2B infrastructure. So we can talk about that now, or we can talk about it later. You're on mute again.
Let's talk about it now. No, I mean, look, the B2B transaction that is at risk. Walk us through what that risk is, Mike.
So those who know me know that I'm very much an optimist. So keep that in mind when I go through this. I think there is risk in every direction on B2B transactions for the next 9 months. One of the risks is tour operator OTA. As a consumer, you go to that tour operator OTA, you book the room. Let's say it's a month in advance, so like super long booking window for this COVID environment. If that OTA goes out of business, you show up at your hotel, they have your booking, but the OTA hasn't paid them because the payment mechanism has not gone through. We could spend hours talking about that. That's a huge risk to both the consumer and the hotel, because they're going to have this loyal guest at their property demanding a room because they paid for it, and they're going to have a reservation with a confirmation letter and email, and they're going to be super angry. Other scenario, that same flow, Guest goes to an OTA, pays the OTA actually pays the hotel, and then the hotel goes out of business. Guest shows up, there's no hotel, the OTA has a risk of having to reaccommodate that. You layer in meeting and events, you layer in all of these things. I mean, I think we're going into an environment where you can't be sure, because you don't know the financial statements for an individual hotel property. You can't be sure to know whether a hotel is going to exist. You can't be sure, with the exception of a couple of large ones that are publicly traded, you can't be sure that a tour operator or an OTA is going to exist. You get down the path of a small travel agency, the lack of demand, given that we're going to see over the next 9 months, given the complexity of our B2B transactions, is really scary to me. And I think the risks of getting COVID at a hotel property are the ones that we rightfully have focused on up until this point. So now people can go to hotels and not feel like they're going to die when they get in an elevator. So that's a great step forward. One of the reasons why I thought it was important to have this discussion today is we are going into, everyone projects we're going into a next wave of COVID. My point is, whether there's a next wave of COVID or not, there's a next wave of risk that is very different than the risk that we've seen thus far.
Jayson, anything to add?
I mean, not on that particularly. I mean, I think, part of what Mike is saying is there's the risk piece on the B2B transactions, but again, making sure that, while we have the time, having the right infrastructure or systems, et cetera, in place to handle these B2B transactions when they resume, right? And making sure they're processed effectively, seamlessly, and at the right costs. And those are the types of things that hopefully, the treasurers and the revenue management folks are, or even distributions folks at these hotels are, thinking about.
Okay. So on the B2C side, we said that we will see less card-present transactions, more e-commerce transactions, and this may, push the adoption for, greater standards and higher security. On the B2B side, Mike has a lot of doom and, or I guess concerns, if you will. Let's talk about how we can mitigate these concerns. Let's talk about what we can do in order to stay on top of this so that we are not stuck with, screaming customers outside of our door, right? Or because there will be businesses that will nicely overcome this, right? And that will be okay coming out of this crisis. So let's talk a little bit what we can do, at least in the next 3 to 6 months, or 9 months, whichever duration that Mike suggested, in order to, come out this stronger. Mike, do you want to start?
Sure. Have I ever said no to that question? So the first thing is, I realize I'm sounding the alarm, and perhaps there's an element of hyperbole involved, but it's a fear. So I think the first thing that I would say that we need to do is we need to monitor these situations. I don't think that anyone in the distribution realm spends a lot of time looking at the financial performance of their distribution partners. So I don't think any distribution partners spend a lot of time looking at their at the financial performance of where they're sending guests. So I think just being aware of that part makes a really big difference. The second is, a little plug for the Open Payment Alliance. We've been working on this, and the co-chairs of that group are Xavi Ginesta at the Voxel Group and Dee Thomas at Onyx CenterSource. And we've been doing this project with HTNG to design industry standards that are, should be published in the next month. But those solutions have been designed long-term to create a more effective B2B processing environment. On the hotel side, something simple as if you're getting a virtual credit card for payment, make sure that you process it the second you can. Because if you don't process the VCC through your acquirer, it doesn't do you any good. So I guess to answer your question, be aware of the financial position of your experience of your partners. B, join the OPA, and C, get payment as quickly as you can, acknowledging that every other partner in the chain is going to try to pay you as late as they can because of the whole cash flow thing we talked about before.
Okay. Jayson, anything to add there?
I mean, there's always stuff to add on that particular topic. I mean, I think I'll hold off on that one.
Okay. So, and then on top of that, if I'm not mistaken, just to round this up,
yep,
booking windows will also continue to decrease. Payment windows will continue to decrease. That's not going to go away. That's actually going to probably come down even further. To Mike's point, if I realize as a consumer that, my money is at risk, I will keep it onto me for as long as I can. Is that fair?
Yeah, we'll go with that. Yeah.
Okay. So, which is not great because it helps. It's difficult for businesses to, forecast, to anticipate demand if they're sitting at 0 occupancy on a Friday night and suddenly run at 50% occupancy because they have an influx of local travelers. That's going to be hard to manage. Bringing us back to initial comments of Mike, track and monitor, ideally in real time, the information that is available to you.
Yeah, it's not going to be a good situation for anyone. I unfortunately don't think for the next 9 months.
All right. I want to plug the HEDNA conference in Vienna, right? Because that's hopefully the next conference where we all get together and meet in person. And even if we're wearing a mask, which I hope we're not, but let's say we are.
You might like a mask if you're looking the way you are today.
That's right. That's right. You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. I should maybe wear a mask if I have another bike accident. So sometime in the spring, we will all convene in Vienna for a conference at a HEDNA conference. Using that as an example, what's the ideal payment flow? And anyone can start. Mike, if you want to start with air, and we go to the conference. I'm just curious when, how, and what's the optimal way of payments in that context?
For our travelers?
For our travelers, for our attendees.
So on the air side, I think most of the airlines have done a really good job of changing of redesigning their change fees. So from an air standpoint, it probably makes sense to book earlier because you can always get the value back and you don't necessarily have to fly to Vienna for it. I think my novice travel skills would say that airfares are going to probably be artificially low for the next few months. So I might book ahead for that. I think you as HEDNA president can probably answer the question of when should we pay for registration? And I'll leave it to Jayson on the hotel side.
Well, on the registration, we've always been very flexible, which means that we've always refunded customers or attendees or members, if you will, and non-members if they cancel their registration. And we continue to be flexible on that particular perspective. Of course, we'd like to plan ahead and know how many people will actually attend. So, part of it will be understanding government regulation. Part of it will be understanding, will we be able to enter the country? Will we be able to leave our country in which we live? And will we be able to get back? Because that's sort of the other important piece. A vaccine will help. And we're all keeping fingers crossed that by, I think, May or April, whenever we do our conference, that it will actually be in place and that will be successful. So registration will open in January, and for those who dare, please register. Jayson, do you want to talk about hotels?
I mean, just briefly. I think, this follows some of the things I've been saying before. I think guest expectations around payments is changing. I think what we didn't say though, but we're kind of alluding to it, is people, I guess, want to have more choice and control over how they pay. Hence, it really makes the work of the guest-centric payments group that much more important to come up with a framework and approach such that consumers truly can pay the way that they want to pay, as opposed to the hotel controlling elements of the payment types and the ultimate experience. So, I would just say that, again, now is probably the time while there's less volume, less people traveling, to begin to think about how can, us as a hotel association, just people in the industry, really set up a truly guest-centric payment experience so that it's ready, it's purposely built once that volume returns, into it, or 3 years down the road.
Well, excellent. We want to continue the conversation, and we have a lot of working groups, and I'll ask Mike to work through these to sort of just illustrate what we're talking about inside of HEDNA when it comes to payments, and how important your participation contribution is throughout this, I guess, challenging time. Mike, do you want to give a quick overview of where we are with each of these?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've addressed quite a bit about them already, but we have 3 payment-related working groups within HEDNA that are active. One is the Open Payment Alliance. As I'd referenced earlier, they are designing technical API standards for the industry to receive and process B2B transactions. Really, one of the early goals for that project was to remove the fax from the transmission of virtual credit cards, which remarkably many hotels still use as a form of payment receipt. Over the course of COVID, that group has modified a little bit to start to look at some of the timing issues that we discussed earlier. I would encourage you to check out the HEDNA website for some details, and you can also go to openpaymentalliance.org, where there's a lovely video animation about what that group is trying to accomplish. Guest-centric payments, we are really trying to look at how do hoteliers put the guest at the center of the payment experience. And unlike everything else that hoteliers do, payments are not hospitable. It is often done based on where the property is located, not where the guest is coming from. And whenever we have cross-border travel again, most hotels cannot handle the payment preferences of one of the largest outbound travel clients, the outbound Chinese travelers, and that's primarily because of the payments that are used in China are very different than the payments that are used in the US and Europe. And last, we have our third-party commission group, which is diving into a couple of very specific areas for the rest of this year. They are actually coordinating with the Open Payment Alliance to make sure that the data flow in the Open Payment Alliance Payment Manager facilitates easier processing of commission payments, but also with some of the recent government regulations and trying to generate additional tax revenue, they're seeing a significant number of challenges with changes in tax laws across the world. So the group, as recently as yesterday, decided to create a focus area on some of these new tax implications. And so those are the 3 payment working groups. platforms.
Excellent. Well, guys, I want to thank you for joining us today and walking us through this, disrupted ecosystem and value exchange. COVID has certainly not only disrupted payments, but has also had its impact on payments and the exchanges of, values, if you will. Thank you to all the participants for participating. As always, this will be posted online, and you can review the commentary of both myself, Mike, and Jayson, and hopefully find that insightful. So thank you both for joining. Thank you for being here, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, guys.